Hello there, world of tankers. Welcome to the channel. I'm your host, Droodles Blitz, and in today's video, we're going to be talking about how Wargaming is lying to you about the latest equipment changes in the game. The big problem has to do with vertical stabilizers and refined gun. Now, this is something that I've been harping Wargaming on for years now, and I was really hoping that with the latest equipment rebalancing, they were going to solve the problem of nerfing refined gun and making Vstabs actually effective. Unfortunately, that's just not the case. Let's start with refined gun. Refined gun gives you a 11% base dispersion buff. What this means is when you're driving, when you're sitting still, it doesn't matter what you're doing, your aiming circle is going to be 11% smaller. That's really as simple as it is. So whatever your normal base aiming circle size is, subtract 11% from that. Vehicles with obviously much worse dispersion are going to get a huge buff from this. The BZT-70 goes from 0.453 to 0.403. That is a huge buff to its overall base dispersion. What Vstabs does is it allows your vehicle to have 17% better accuracy during the tank and turret movement. And that sounds like a bigger buff, right? It is a 6% increase over refined gun. Not only that, but it supposedly makes your aiming time faster. And we can see that the BZT-70 is a great pick to do this study on because it has literally the worst on-movement dispersion in the entire game of Tier 10. It actually has garbage values in every single regard. And that's perfect because it gives us a great example of what we're looking at here. The major thing that I wanted to see happen with vertical stabilizers is when you were driving your tank on the move, this vehicle would be more accurate than if you were running refined gun. Your aiming circle would be smaller, and it would aim in a little faster. Unfortunately, from my testing, that is not the case. And I've tested it with quite a few other vehicles, and I have to tell you, refined gun is still flat better in every single regard. What we're going to do is very simple. We are in a training room, and we are now driving our BZT-70 at top speed. We are just going to take a screenshot of our aiming circle at max speed, and then we're going to paste that right in front of us. The reason why is because then we're going to take another screenshot of refined gun and compare it to Vstabs, and you'll see the exact size of the aiming circle. Now we're going to take one more screenshot right there, fully aimed in. So now we have the vehicle full speed on move and fully aimed in. We're going to exit out, and we're going to go back into the garage and swap our equipment loadout. As you can see, we are now running refined gun, and if we go back into the training room, now that we've gotten our vehicle up to max speed, we will once again screenshot the aiming circle, and then we can paste that right here. And then we will take one more screenshot fully aimed in with refined gun, and we will also paste that right next to it over here. So just like that, we have now taken 2 screenshots with a refined gun and 2 screenshots with vertical stabilizers. So let's compare. Let's lower the opacity of this screenshot here. And what will you notice? Well, there's really no change. In fact, if we move this a little bit, you can see that there are 2 circles. However, with refined gun and vertical stabilizers, there is almost 0 difference in the aiming circle on full speed movement. That is literally the entire buff of Vstabs is giving you better on-move dispersion, and it's completely irrelevant with a vehicle having the worst on-movement dispersion in Tier 10. Okay, well, now we can focus on the fully aimed-in version, and if we lower the opacity, you will obviously see that the vehicle running refined gun has a substantially smaller aiming circle. I mean, if we zoom in far enough here, yeah, it is literally a substantially smaller aiming circle. So really, in no world here are you going to be having a benefit running vertical stabilizers over a refined gun. There's not a single advantage that it's actually giving you a buff. To take this a step further, I went over to our Lord and Savior, ChatGPT. I'm sorry, guys, I sucked up your water supply and raised your power bill, but it was for a good reason. I didn't really understand why Vstabs, even though on paper it sounds like it's giving you a bigger buff, didn't have any noticeable difference and in fact looked flat worse in game. And now that we have the math, it actually makes a lot of sense. The base dispersion of the BZT-70 is 0.453 and the on-movement dispersion penalty is plus 279, which means that if you're using refined gun multiplied by the 11% better base dispersion and the movement penalty with this tank full speed on the move, you are looking at 0.682 base dispersion. And if you are using Vstabs, and we do the same math it's going to be 0.685. That is a 0.003 difference, less than half of a percent, which means that the reticle cannot visibly show that. So in other words, the screenshots look identical, which is exactly what we saw in game. So there is literally zero reason to run Vstabs on a BZT70. Terrible base accuracy making refined 11% valuable, and the on-movement dispersion is also valuable, but it doesn't really matter because no matter what, you're going to have the same on-movement dispersion values when fully on-move, even if you were just running refined gun. So as ChatGPT says, so your screenshots are accurate for the BZT driving straight. Refined and Vstabs produce practically the same on-move accuracy. But unfortunately, that is useless because the BZT70 is going to have a substantially smaller aiming circle when sitting still. As we can see here, I said, so there isn't really much of a reason to use Vstabs on the tank. Reply, correct. For the BZT70, there's very little reason to use Vstabs over a refined gun. At straight, full speed, their reticles are practically identical, but refined gives you a noticeably smaller, fully aimed circle, better accuracy while stationary, better accuracy at every stage of aiming, essentially the same accuracy while driving straight. Vstabs only meaningfully wins when you're moving, turning the hull, and rotating the turret simultaneously, because it reduces all of the bloom penalties. But as ChatGPT says, that is a fairly limited situation. How many times in a freaking BZT70 am I shooting on the move, turning my turret, and driving? Like, it's just not going to happen. In other words, there's literally no reason, even for the most inaccurate tank in the game, to run Vstabs. So then I thought, okay, how about the AMX M4? So once again, we've got the base dispersion, the penalty, and everything. With refined gun, your AMX M4 full speed is 0.508 dispersion, and with Vstabs, it's 0.516. So that means refined gun is actually almost 1.5% more accurate full on move than it would be with Vstabs. In other words, again, there is no reason to use Vstabs. Even if you're moving and turning the hull and the turret, Vstabs is only going to be 5% more accurate. That's the biggest buff you can possibly get. So again, refined is probably better on the AMX M4, it is slightly better when driving straight, and is 11% better when fully aimed. Then I said, is there any tank that actually gives you an advantage? You know what it replied? The grill. And even with the grill, you're only looking at about a 2.4% better buff while driving, and if you're turning the turret, then about 8.3%. But as I replied, it's a grill. You're not shooting on the move to begin with. In other words, there is basically no reason to run refined gun. And if we scroll down here, I said, in other words, refined is basically flat better for almost all tanks in all situations. ChatGPT, yes, practically speaking, refined gun is now the better choice for almost every tank. 11% better fully aimed accuracy, better accuracy while stationary, better accuracy while moving straight on many tanks, nearly identical moving accuracy, even on tanks with terrible bloom, such as the BZT70. What's interesting is that ChatGPT even mentions at the bottom here the change from 15% refined versus 12%, Vstabs to 11% and 17% sounds like a major Vstabs advantage, but because refined improves the underlying accuracy in every situation, Vstabs still struggles to produce a meaningful real-world advantage, which is kind of what I've concluded. I have been messing around with Vstabs for the past couple of days since the update. I've been messing around with refined, and from all of my testing, it just seemed completely useless to run Vstabs on any tank. And I always find it crazy because there's people that still try to argue in my comment section, oh, Droodles, you're wrong. You don't know what you're talking about. Vstabs is better. Vstabs has, distinct advantages. I remember one of my friends who's in Origin, I'm not going to say his name, but some of my friends will know who I'm talking about. We had like a multiple hour argument because he kept trying to tell me that running Vstabs on the AMX M4 made the gun better. And I said that's not physically possible because that's not how math works. And this is when refined gun was even better. And it still is proven that with refined gun, you're going to be more accurate, even with the AMX M4, using refined versus Vstabs. So if you have been running Vstabs on your tanks thinking it's going to be better, stop. There's literally no tank in the entire game where running Vstabs is actually going to give you an advantage. This is why Wargaming is lying to you. This is why in the beginning of the video I mentioned it, right? Because Wargaming literally has no clue how to balance their game. It took me 5 seconds to go into game, take 2 screenshots and compare them, and then go to ChatGPT and be like, hey, why is this math not mathing? How hard is it Wargaming, a multi-billion-dollar company, to figure out that Vstabs needs to have a bigger buff? For Vstabs to genuinely be viable, Wargaming either needs to nerf Refined Gun further down to like 7 or 6%, or they need to give Vstabs a substantial buff, which is what it originally had in Reforged. I don't know why they nerfed it down to 17%. It should be a 25 or even 30% buff on move because of how good Refined is. That's really as simple as it gets. But as of right now, there is virtually zero reason to run Vstabs. So, hopefully you enjoyed today's video. If you did, make sure to smash that subscribe button down below because I will be the only creator talking about this and keeping it real. I'll see you all in the next one.